Good afternoon, everyone. My name is Tania. I am the food systems editor at Devex. I think most of us in this room dedicate ourselves to the pursuit of truth in some way, whether that's through scientific analysis, combing through data, or interviewing experts for a news story. But as the media landscape becomes more polarized and fractured, it's become easier than ever for misinformation to take hold. Why trust the New York Times or Devex or CNN? Why read 78 pages of Eat Lancet 2.0 when you can just go on Instagram and TikTok and your algorithm will serve you any influencer who can tell you anything that you want to hear? The launch of the first Eat Lancet report, as I think many of us in this room know, saw a lot of online backlash. I encourage you to check out the Changing Market Foundation report that came out last week. They were able to track this web of actors who coordinated the backlash against the previous Eat Lancet report, and they found that so much of it came from the meat industry. And I think a lot of people are holding their breath and expecting a similar backlash against this report. So that brings us to the question today: how do we fight back, or better yet, how do we get ahead of it? And I'm thrilled to be joined by two expert speakers. Theresa Marteau, she is one of the Eat Lancet commissioners and the director of Behavioral and Health Research Unit at the University of Cambridge. And Kevin Hall, who is a nutrition scientist who, until very recently, worked at the United States NIH. So let's get to it. Theresa and Kevin, when you look at the media landscape these days, what do you think has changed the most in the past couple of years when it comes to misinformation in public health, climate, and nutrition?
Good afternoon, everyone, and thank you, Tania. I think it's important to acknowledge that there's nothing new here. Misinformation has been happening for decades, centuries. It's also not new that misinformation travels faster than truth. So falsehood flies, and the truth comes limping after it. Those are the words of the English satirist Jonathan Swift, 1705. Now, what has changed, as you've pointed out, is the scale, the speed, and the reach, fueled by social media platforms and now AI. And it matters, and that's why we're here, because the failure to protect evidence from misinformation is what stops effective action from citizens and governments, leading to a delay, a dilution and derailment of effective interventions.
Yeah, just to pick up on that, I mean, I think that in the nutrition and health space in particular, there's been a long, long history of misinformation. And it's often based on, a kernel of truth, right? That's what a lot of the focus is on, this kernel of truth, but then actually the focus is not on that truth, but it's wrapping that truth in a pseudoscientific, compelling narrative told with a lot of conviction and a degree of certainty that is motivating to people. And while there's been this long history of that, I think you're right saying that social media influencers have really expanded on that, and our algorithms have siloed us into different competing camps of information and misinformation, as the case may be. As a scientist, one of the challenges in this space is that science takes those compelling sounding, maybe scientific sounding narratives and actually tries to test them. And it's when we test those narratives that we come up with some inconvenient facts that challenge those narratives. And that's kind of what I experienced, unfortunately, in the US, where now I think many folks in the political administration are listening to social media influencers much more than scientists, right? Science only complicates narratives. And even when people have the best of intentions and want to make positive change for health, and I think many folks especially in the grassroots Make America Healthy Again movement, do have those genuine aspirations for health of Americans. a lot of the misinformation and the narratives that are surrounding them are being challenged by science, and that science is actually being suppressed now.
Yeah, that's a really good point. What you said about the information traveling so fast, I think when you have this lengthy report versus social media influencers, you see that so much of the nuance get lost in a simple soundbite that is 1 minute, and somebody really is slick and sounds like they know what they're saying. Kevin, you mentioned the Make America Healthy Again movement and what's going on in the US. I wondered if you could tell us a little bit about your personal story. You recently left the NIH, and what happened, and can you tell us about what you took away from that experience in terms of how misinformation can distort science at the very highest levels of government?
Sure. So my research at the NIH I was there for 20 years, 21 years actually, trying to understand how food and nutrition affects human physiology and the genesis of obesity and type 2 diabetes and various metabolic diseases. In more recent years, I was really focused on ultra-processed foods and what is it about ultra-processed foods that might drive some of these diet-related chronic diseases. And in fact, before the last election, I was actually excited because there was a lot of bipartisan discussion about improving our understanding about how our food system and the food environment is affecting human health. And we were doing exactly that kind of research. Unfortunately, I wasn't able, despite multiple attempts to engage with the administration in the MAHA leadership, to get their interest in hearing about where the science currently is, where we could progress it forward. And in fact, what I experienced was when we published a paper that dealt with the question about how ultra-processed foods might be addictive, and more importantly, from my perspective, how they probably aren't addictive, the mechanisms, we were met with suppression of that science. We were told we couldn't communicate that to the public and that it went against the preconceived notions of RFK Jr. in particular about how these foods are addictive in this particular way. So that kind of pushback and that idea that you're not going to change your opinion, you're not going to listen to what the best science tells you and modify your narrative accordingly is, I think, really problematic moving forward. Sciences are the best thing that humans have come up with to kind of triangulate towards the truth. And yes, we can get it wrong sometimes, and we should admit when we get it wrong, but it's the best thing that we have to kind of developing evidence-based interventions.
Yeah, and however good the science, ultimately scientists typically work inside of institutions. When you're on the inside, and the inside is actually a source of misinformation for the public, how do you handle that? And how do you make the decision that it's time to get out from the inside and sort of fight the good fight from the outside?
I think that was really what I was faced with, right? Which was the aspect of, do you stand up for scientific integrity? That the political leadership is interested in twisting the words that literally the words that you're using to communicate with the public, and downplay certain aspects that you think are important. And I made the decision that I was worried enough about the conduct of future science that I couldn't do it in an unbiased way, and that I was forced to leave and wrap up a 21-year career in a matter of a few weeks, and making sure the transition happened smoothly for our staff.
Yeah, wow, that must have been very, very difficult.
So could I just add, Kevin, you've wrapped up a 21-year career at NIH, but not wrapped up your career completely.
Let's hope not.
Of course not. He has a book coming out, guys. Food Intelligence, I think soon, next month.
That actually came out last week.
Ah, okay, congratulations. Okay.
But I think it's important. The example that you've just given to us is many people in this room would be horrified by it, and it is at one end of a spectrum. But it is a spectrum if we think about misinformation, because all of us are often unwittingly, sometimes wittingly, a party to misinformation. There was one study which looked at press releases that scientists had signed off on. And if you think about the number of times you might have been pushed or pushed yourself into being more certain about the findings from your study. There's huge pressure to do that. And we need to be incredibly careful in terms of ourselves, as well as journalists, as well as we've heard governments, as well as those working within corporations and industries that have particular interests that they are trying to protect. So it is everywhere, but the scale and the nature of it will vary.
Definitely. Communicating is such a big responsibility, no matter what position you are in. On that note, what are some of the ways that we can help rebuild trust in science through more effective communication?
That's a great question. I think that, we learned in the public health community some of the failures that took place when it came to communicating to the public in the face of uncertainty and evolving evidence. That the impression of certainty, the idea that you are going to pronounce that this is the way people should behave and we have a certain quality of evidence, that last bit, emphasizing what the quality of evidence was, that it could in fact change in the future as we gathered more evidence, expressing uncertainty and also expressing when we get it wrong, because we do get it wrong. And being open-minded and to new data and being willing to collect that new data and change your opinion, I think the public will respond to that, as well as being very authentic about where we are at a current stage. I think we learned that the idea that we can just trust the experts is something that's relegated to the past now, that we have to have an authentic voice that can communicate uncertainty and yet communicate the conviction that we have that we're doing the best we can with the best available evidence.
In a series of experiments that colleagues of mine in Cambridge conducted, presenting numerical risk information, they found that when uncertainty was communicated, it didn't undermine trust. It didn't increase it, but it didn't undermine it. So I think that's important. I think also there are, looking at this much more broadly, I mean, misinformation is one of the major threats to science, which is the basis for effective action. So I would sort of stepping back a bit, think that some of the core questions are, what can we do to stop the flow of misinformation? And it's not simple, but we need to think about turning off that tap, and content moderation on social media is something people are talking about. Regulation, however difficult that is, with serious penalties for allowing your platform to continue to produce that. So stopping the flow, increasing the flow of accessible scientific findings in a way that people can readily grasp. So, as you were saying, the social influencers, they've got short messages, and we learnt during the pandemic that it was incredibly important to have a layering of messages. So what's the top line, not necessarily in caps, but what is the top line message communicated in ways that people who don't necessarily understand scientific terminology? What's the top line? A little more information for those who want it, and then more detail, all openly available. And the third thing I would say there's stopping the misinformation, increasing the flow of good quality information, and then there's a particular category which is protecting policymakers from, in particular, lobbyists who can be the biggest vectors of misinformation. And the tobacco industry and the attempts to protect policy making from the tobacco industry, I think, provide one of the best examples. If there's time, I can say a little bit more about that.
Yeah, definitely. I'm so glad you mentioned the tobacco industry, because they, for such a long time, pushed back against evidence, scientific evidence that smoking is so unhealthy. But we saw that over time they lost. So is there anything that can be learned from that campaign and how misinformation ultimately was sidelined?
Well, we had a landmark framework convention, so the UN Framework Convention in Tobacco Control, which came into force in 2005, and over 90% of countries have signed up to that. And the countries that signed up are acknowledging that in order to, well, they've signed up to require that they are going to protect their citizens from the tobacco industry. So they're protecting people by implementing effective policies. And at the core of those effective policies is restricting access of the lobbyists and representatives from the industry to policymakers. So that doesn't mean they can't meet, but they only meet if it's strictly necessary and it's transparent in the public domain. And what the evidence shows us is that the countries that implement those policies most strongly have the most effective policies and the lowest rates of smoking in their countries. So that is where it is working. Now, there's a debate to be had over whether we should think about food industries, alcohol industries, fossil fuel industries in the same way, and people will have different views on that. But that is the only evidence I'm aware of where restricting access, protecting policymakers from misinformation seemingly is having an effect.
Yeah, I'll just add to that. My friend Marion Nessel often likes to say, you know, the food industry are not public service, not public health organizations, right? They have a vested interest, and you have to recognize that. Of course, the difference with tobacco is that we all need to eat. And food industry is going to play a role in what we eat, and we do have to have some degree of engagement with them. But I agree, we need protections to have that lobbying efforts and making sure that they don't have outsized power in decision makers. Kind of going back to how do we regain trust among folks, and I think that in this very highly polarized climate, one of the things I've been impressed with is a friend of mine started this podcast called Why Should I Trust You? Where she brings people with very disparate points of view, not to debate, but just to have a discussion about what's important to them. And it personalizes the other side, so to speak, in ways that I think have been really kind of groundbreaking in the way that we can understand the motivations and intentions of people who disagree with us on certain matters. It's the opportunity to kind of sway opinions in a way that our highly polarized environment does not naturally allow for, and it gets us away from the kind of just rhetorical tricks and arguments that are in the sort of debate culture right now, which is the debate me bro sort of idea of that it doesn't matter what the truth is as long as I score the rhetorical talking points. I think that we can convene those kinds of forums, and that we can bring you know, the folks who are on the opposite side. We don't have to like each other, but we do have to respect each other as people and be able to have productive discussions and productive disagreements, as we heard about in the table rules.
Yeah, maybe the answer is we just all need to learn how to debate better and have more constructive debates.
Well, one of the best models online is not a great model, but one of the best models we have are in citizen assemblies as just a model where you have citizens who are engaging with evidence, helping to discuss and understand what it's showing. And the recommendations that are coming out of some of the citizens' assemblies on climate change are much more supportive of evidence, effective, science-based solutions, and they're further ahead than our government. So that gives me hope. That's one model.
Yeah. Thank you so much for ending on that positive note. I'm afraid we're out of time, but thank you so much for this fascinating discussion.
Thank you.
Thank you.